if you could see with the eyes of faith, you would always see that God is drawing near to you. He's not distant from your grief. He's entered into your grief. He's alongside you. We spend so long fighting death that we feel if we admit our fear, then somehow it will have defeated us. I mean, isn't that just the nature of the human condition in general anyway? We spend so long fighting death, don't we all, that we feel if we somehow admit our fear, death will have defeated us. Well, what I want us to see this evening is to see from a person who didn't just fight death, but he overcame death. He defeated death. That's the claim really at the center of Christianity, that Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God who defeated death. And we see something of a precursor to his resurrection in this passage as we see him raise this young man, this young boy from death. So let's look at it and see what it means and what its implications are for us, as we're going to see three things as we take it through the parts of the story that Luke tells us. First of all, we'll look at the funeral, then we're going to look at the touch, and then we're going to look at the response. The funeral, the touch, the response. Let's look first of all at the funeral. So here's the scene. Jesus has been doing miracles around the general area of Galilee, and he's approaching a town called Nain. And we're told in verse 11 that as he approaches, he's got his disciples with him and a large crowd who are now following him. And as they approach the town gates of Nain, coming out of the town is a funeral procession, also with a large crowd. So you kind of got the meeting point of two large crowds, and everything just starts to slow down. And then verse 12, as he approached the town gate, we're told a dead person was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. Luke is a master of detail. He's always at pains to place things in space, time, and history. So we see this is no myth, no story. This is recounting of eyewitness testimonies. And he places this in a particular place at a particular time with particular people who could bear witness to these events. But not just that. He is a brilliant narrator. And I wonder if you noticed how he weaves in so much detail and background in just a few words. Notice what we're told about this funeral. First of all, we're told that it's a funeral going on. That's the first wave of grief. All the attention seems to be on this poor lady, and she is the one who's the chief griever. That's the first wave of grief hits her, that it's the death that she's having to preside over. But then secondly, we're told that it's the death of her son. Now, we all know deep in our guts that parents should not have to bury their children. Parents shouldn't outlive their children. There's something very profound about that. The worst or the most painful and sorrowful funerals I've ever taken have always been the funerals of children and trying to console parents in the midst of their grief. So this is the kind of second wave of grief that she's experiencing, not just any death, but the death of her son, and not just any son, but her only son. She's lost her only child. And then finally, Luke layers in the final bit of detail, which is that she's a widow. In other words, she's no stranger to death. She's already lost her husband. And now in an ancient society where it was hard for women to provide for themselves, not just on an emotional level, but on a social level, in losing her only son and having already lost her husband, it's no exaggeration to say that she has lost everything. And you feel the pathos in the text as we enter into the emotional reality of what she's going through. A woman not just in grief, but in the profound grief of losing a son and the profound grief of having lost everything. And the reason that Luke, I think, presents it like this is because he wants us to enter into both the emotional reality of what's going on, but also what I would call the existential reality. There's a loss going on here on two fronts. There's the emotional loss, we'll deal with that in a moment, and there's also the existential loss. We'll come to that in a bit. First of all, the emotional loss. Death impacts all of us. When the great Christian thinker Augustine was writing his Confessions, he documents and recounts the grief that he experienced at the death of his mother, Monica. And he writes this: "The tears streamed down, and I let them flow as freely as they would, making of them a pillow for my heart. On them it rested." One of the things about Christianity is it's not stoicism. It's not about emotionally distancing ourselves from reality. It's about an engagement with reality. Jesus, when he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead in John chapter 11, even though he's about to bring him back from the dead, he enters into the emotional reality. And in the shortest, but really the most profound verse, arguably in the whole of Scripture, we hear, Jesus wept. God is not distant to grief. God enters into the place of sorrow and grief. He draws near. Notice where Jesus is in this narrative. He's not from a distance, observing from afar. It's not some disconnected observation, but he draws near. First of all, he draws near to the town of Nain, and then he draws near to the woman, and then he actually gets involved in the funeral. Why do I mention that? I mention that because one of the things when we are grieving is that we feel distant. We feel isolated. Grief has an isolating kind of quality to it. If I can be anecdotal for a bit, my family and I have experienced plenty of grief at death in the last couple of years. We lost my father very suddenly to cancer 2 years ago. We lost Rebecca's mother very suddenly to cancer a bit over 6 months ago. And we've experienced a lot of grief. And one of the challenges in the grief is not to be isolated from one another, to stay connected, because you feel very isolated even when others around you are grieving too. More than that, you feel distant from God, as though he's abandoned you in the midst of your grief. Maybe you're coming here this evening and maybe you're experiencing something like that. You feel distant from God. Maybe you've experienced that in the past. But please notice in the text where God is. God is in the person of Jesus Christ, drawing near to the person in her grief. That is always God's posture. I know it doesn't always feel like that, but if you could see with the eyes of faith, you would always see that God is drawing near to you. He's not distant from your grief. He's entered into your grief. He's alongside you. The emotional sense of the loss. But there's also more than that. There's the existential losses we could talk about it, which I don't mean to philosophize, but when we grieve, part of the weight of grief is this profound sense that it should not be this way. And when you pause and reflect on it, that's strange, because death is, on one hand, the most natural thing in the world. After all, every single person who's ever lived has always died. The animal kingdom shows this. Animals die. It's just the way of life. And yet, we as human beings feel to the very core of our bones that it should not be this way. Because the reality is that the loss of death takes away far more than just our loved ones from us. Great philosopher Plato once asked this question: must not everything be swallowed up in death? He's talking about the way that death is kind of like a bottomless pit. It doesn't just take away our loved ones, our friends, our family members, those that we deeply care about, but it takes away far more than that. It takes away people's best years. It takes away our achievements. It seems to threaten very meaning of life and significance. It takes away hope. It's a bottomless pit that takes away so much from us. It seems to undermine our very intuition that we are significant and that we matter and that we should have permanence, and yet everything about death seems to undermine that. It's the great bottomless pit that takes things away. The philosophers who grappled with this in the early part of the 20th century, the existentialists, people like Sartre and Camus and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, they were the first people in the modern era, or late modern, early modern era, to really grapple with the reality of death. And Sartre wrote a novel about it called Nausea, which was all about a person who comes to the reality that death suddenly impacts everything. And when she realizes it, it kind of creates a sense of nausea in her life. And that's the great problem of death. It's not just the emotional problem, it's the existential problem. It seems to take away that which is so profoundly important to us. And so how do we deal with it in the West? Well, like those two doctors in Scrubs, aren't we? We either try to say well-intentioned but ultimately false aphorisms of, I suppose, as long as you have a few good thoughts. I've heard people do that many times at funerals that I've presided over. They're well-intentioned, but ultimately they lack the substance to deal with death. Or we try to do avoid it. Just don't talk about it, and maybe you're even feeling some of the awkwardness now about it, right? We just don't want to talk about it, and yet it's the great reality. But there is a better way, the way of engagement through Jesus Christ. That's the funeral. That brings us then wonderfully to the touch. Verses 13 to 15, the touch. Really, all of the action around these verses focus on Jesus doing this very strange thing, which we'll point out in a moment, where he touches the funeral bier. But first of all, look at how Luke, with mastery of the kind of narrative, slows everything down. It's almost like the camera lens is zooming in. Before you catch me afterwards and tell me they didn't have cameras in those days, I know, I'm using a modern metaphor, right? But it's almost like everything slows down and zooms in on the moment through a series of small sentences. Then he went up, that is Jesus, and touched the bier that they were carrying him on. The bearer stood still. He said, "Young man, I say to you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to talk. And then the most beautiful phrase, "And Jesus gave him back to his mother." Imagine the scene. The funeral procession is going on. It's Jesus, the front of this massive crowd. And he doesn't walk by, he walks into the funeral. And in those days, there were designated people who would carry the mat, which had the body on it, which is the bier here. And they were designated because to touch or come into contact with anything that itself had touched a dead body would make you ceremonially and ritually unclean, which meant you couldn't be in community for 7 days and you couldn't enter into temple worship for 7 days. So there were designated people, but no one else would dream of touching the body or anything it had touched. But Jesus walks straight up, and what does he do? He touches it. And at that moment, everyone is stunned. Everything stops. All eyes look to him. Now pause, what's going on here? Well, it can't be that Jesus needs to touch the body to effect the miracle, because we've already seen the type of power that Jesus has in the early chapters of Luke's gospel. In just the beginning of chapter 7, just last week, we saw that he heals the centurion's servant with just a thought from a distance. He doesn't even need to be in the same vicinity to do a miracle. Such is his power. So it's nothing to do with that. No, he's trying to make a point. And what's the point he's making? Well, the reason that in the Israelite society, that if you touched a body or if you came into contact with anything that a dead body had itself touched, you were ceremonially unclean, was it was God's way of helping us to grasp the seriousness of death and the way that death has a kind of contaminating effect on everything around it. We talk about this, don't we? We say something like, death has touched the community or death has touched their family. Of course, it might have just impacted one person directly, but it impacts everyone by association. We feel the effects of death. It's kind of like a contaminant on our communities or on our families. And actually, that's one of the pictures that the Bible has for death. It's like a shroud over all of humanity. And so the touch of death is something that we all want to avoid. But notice here, it's not that Jesus is touched by death and contaminated by death. There's no hint that he has to become ceremonially unclean after this incident. No, he touches death. And his touch is a healing and a life-giving touch. In other words, death might touch us and contaminate us, but for him, the source of pure life, holiness and goodness, his touch is a resurrection touch.